The moment we shift our attention to geological history or geological time as such, we humans have been so preoccupied with the history of human civilization that we did not take into consideration the planetarity, the cosmopolitanity, and of course, the position of modernity as such, as Bruno Latour talks about, as Dipesh Chakrabarty talks about. Today, when we look at the, the contributions of Dipesh Chakrabarty in his fascinating book, Habitations of Modernity, we have to look at the history of Subaltern itself as pioneered by and flourishing under the leadership of Ranojit Guho. So that aspect and the questions of history, the way the ontology of history has come into being, a small history of subaltern studies becomes very important. So that is why I have taken the small section, very very important and very clarifying and very concise precision making discourse on the small history of subaltern studies written by Dipesh Chakrabarty would be of much help for scholars. I am reading: in a wide ranging critique of post colonial studies, Arif Dirlik suggests that while the historiographic innovations of subaltern studies are welcome, they are mere applications of methods pioneered by British Marxist historians, albeit modified by third world sensibilities. Dirlik writes: most of the generalizations that appear in the discourse of post colonial intellectuals from India may appear novel in the historiography of India, but are not discoveries from broader perspectives. The historical writings of subaltern studies historians represent the application of Indian historiography of trends in historical writings that were quite widespread by the 1970s under the impact of social historians such as E.P. Thompson, Eric Hobsbawm, and a host of others. Without wishing either to inflate the claims of subaltern studies, scholars ought to deny what they may indeed have learned from the British Marxist historians. I would like to demonstrate that Dirlik's reading of subaltern studies seriously misjudges that which makes the series a post colonial project. To that end, I provide here a small history of the series. I call this history small not simply because of its brevity, but also because, following Benjamin's small history of photography, the narrative here has a very particular end in focus. I argue against critics who have advised otherwise why subaltern studies could never be a more reproduction in India of the English tradition of writing history from below. Subaltern studies and debates in modern Indian history. The academic subject called modern Indian history is a relatively recent development, a result of research and discussion in various universities, mainly in India, the United Kingdom, the United States, the Australia after the end of British imperial rule in August 1947. In its early phase, this area of scholarship bore all the signs of an ongoing struggle between tendencies affiliated with imperialist biases in Indian history and a nationalist desire on the part of historians in India to decolonize the past. Marxism was understandably mobilized in aid of the nationalist project of intellectual decolonization. Bipon Chandro's The Rise and Growth of Economic Nationalism in India, O'Neill Seal's The Emergence of Indian Nationalism, A.R. Desai's Social Background of Indian Nationalism, D.L.O.'s collection Sounding in Modern South Asian History, the many seminal articles published by Bernard Cohn, now collected in An Anthropologist Among the Historians, debated around Maurice Davis Morris's assessment of the results of British rule in India, and the work of other scholars in the 1960s raised new and controversial questions regarding the nature and results of colonial rule in India. Did the imperialist British deserve credit after all for making India a developing, modern, and united country? Were the Hindu Muslim conflicts that resulted in the formation of the two states of Pakistan and India consequences of the divide and rule policies of the British, or were they reflections of divisions internal to South Asian society? Official documents of the British government of India and traditions of imperial history writing always portrayed colonial rule as being beneficial to India and its people. They applauded the British for bringing to the subcontinent political unity, modern education institutions, modern industries, a sense of nationalism, the rule of law, and so on. Indian historians in the 1960s, many of whom had English degrees and most of whom belonged to a generation that grew up in the final years of British rule, challenged that view. They argued instead that colonialism had deleterious effects on economic and cultural developments. Modernity and the nationalist desire for political unity, they claimed, were not so much British gifts to India as fruits of struggles undertaken by the Indians themselves. Nationalism and colonialism thus emerged, not surprisingly, as the two major areas of research and debate defining the field of modern Indian history in the 1960s and 1970s. At one extreme of this debate was the Cambridge historian Anil Seal, whose 1968 Emergence of Indian Nationalism described nationalism as the work of a tiny elite reared in the education institutions that the British set up in India. This elite, as Seal puts it, both competed and collaborated with the British in their search for power and privilege. A few years later, this idea was pushed to an extreme in the collection Locality, Province and Nation, to which Seal, his colleague John Gallacher, and a pose of their doctoral students contributed. Their writings discounted the role of ideas and idealism in history and foregrounded an extremely narrow view of what constituted political and economic interest for historical actors. They argued that it was the penetration of the colonial state into the local structures of power in India, a move prompted by the financial self-interest of the Raj rather than by any altruistic motives that eventually and by degrees drew Indian elites into the colonial governmental process. According to this argument, the involvement of Indians in colonial instruments set off a scramble across the indigenous elites who combined opportunistically and around factions formed along vertical lines of patronage to jockey for power and privilege within the limited opportunities for self-rule provided by the British. Such, the Cambridge historians claimed, was the real dynamic of that which outside observers or naive historians may have mistaken for an idealistic struggle for freedom. Nationalism and colonialism both came out in this history as interdependent phenomena. The history of nationalism and colonialism both came out in this history as interdependent phenomena. The history of Indian nationalism, said Seal, was the rivalry between India and Indian, its relationship with imperialism, that of the mutual clinging of two unsteady men of straw. At the other extremes of this debate was the Indian historian Bipin Chandra. In the 1970s, a professor at the prestigious Jawaharlal Nehru University in Delhi, Chandra and his colleagues saw Indian history of the colonial period as an epic battle between the forces of nationalism and those of colonialism. Drawing on both Marxist writings and Lenin and Latin American theories of dependency and underdevelopment, Chandra argued that colonialism was a regressive force that distorted all developments in India's society and polity. The social, political, and economic ills of post-independence India, including those of mass poverty and religious and caste conflict, could be blamed on the political economy of colonialism. However, he saw nationalism in a different, contrasting light as a regenerative force, as the antithesis of colonialism, something that united and produced an Indian people by mobilizing them for struggle against the British. Nationalist leaders such as Gandhi and Nehru were the authors of such an anti imperial movement for unity. Chandra claimed that the conflict of interest and ideology between the colonizers and the Indian people was the most important conflict of British India. All others, whether of class or of class or caste, were secondary to the principal contradiction and were to be treated as such in histories of nationalism. Yet, as research progressed in the 1970s, there emerged a series of increasingly serious difficulties with both these narratives. It was clear that the Cambridge version of nationalist politics without ideas or idealism would never ring true to scholars in the subcontinent who had themselves experienced the desire for freedom from colonial rule. On the other hand, the nationalist historians' story of there having been a moral war between colonialism and nationalism wore increasingly thin as research by younger scholars in India and elsewhere brought new material to light. New information on the mobilization of the poor, peasants, tribals, and workers by elite nationalist leaders in the course of the Gandhian mass movements in the 1920s and 1930s, for example, suggested a strongly reactionary side to the principal nationalist party. The Indian National Congress, Gyanendra Pandey at Oxford, David Hardiman, and David Arnold at Sussex, all of them later to become members of the Subaltern Studies collectively. Majid Siddiqui and Kapil Kumar in Delhi, Histes Rajan Sanyal in Kolkata, Brian Stoddart, Stephen Henningham, and Max Harcourt in Australia and others elsewhere documented the way in which nationalist leaders would suppress with a heavy hand peasants or workers' tendency to exceed the self imposed limit of the nationalist political agenda by protesting the oppression meted out to them, not only by the British but by the indigenous ruling groups as well. From the point of view of a younger generation of historians whom Ranojit Guha, following Salman Rushdie, has called Midnight's Children, neither the Cambridge thesis propounding a skeptical view of Indian nationalism nor the nationalist Marxist thesis glossing over or assimilating to a nationalist historiographic agenda. Real conflicts of ideas and interests between the elite nationalists and their socially subordinate followers was an adequate response to the problems of post-colonial history writing in India. Response to the problems of post-colonial history writing in India. The persistence of religious and caste conflict in post-independence India, the war between India and China in 1962, which made official nationalism sound hollow and eventually gave rise to fascination with Maoism among many urban educated young people in India, the outbreak of a violent Maoist political movement in India known as the Naxalite movement, which drew many urban youths into the countryside in the late 1960s and early 1970s. All these and many other factors combined to alienate younger historians from the shibboleths of nationalist historiography. This alienation was further strengthened by the rise in popularity of peasant studies among Anglo-American academics in the 1970s. All this historiographic discontent, however, was still floundering in the old liberal and positivist paradigms inherited from English traditions of history writing, even as it was searching for a path towards decolonizing the field of Indian history. Now we are moving into a deeper terrain, the subaltern studies as paradigm shift 1982 to 1987. Subaltern studies intervened in this situation in 1982. Intellectually, it began on the very terrain that it was to contest historiography that had its roots in the colonial education system. It started as a critique of two contending schools of history, the Cambridge school and that of the nationalist historians. Both these approaches, declared Guha in a statement that inaugurated the series, Subaltern Studies were elitist. They wrote up the history of nationalism as the story of an achievement by the elite classes, whether Indian or British. For all their merits, they could not explain the contributions made by people on their own, that is, independent of the elites, to the making and development of this nationalism. It will be clear from this statement of Guha's that subaltern studies was part of an attempt to align historical reasoning with larger movements for democracy in India. It looked for an anti elitist approach to history writing, and in this it had much in common with the history from below approaches pioneered in English historiography by Christopher Hill, E.P. Thompson, E.J. Hobsbawm, and others. Both subaltern studies and the history from below school were Marxist in inspiration. Both owed a certain intellectual depth to the Italian communist Antonio Gramsci in trying to move away from deterministic Stalinist readings of Marx. The declared aim of subaltern studies was to produce historical analysis in which the subaltern groups were viewed as the subjects of history. As Guha put it once in the course of introducing a volume of subaltern studies, we are indeed opposed to much of the prevailing academic practice in historiography for its failure to acknowledge the subaltern as the maker of his own destiny. This critique lies at the very heart of our project. But at the same time, Goho's theorization of the project signaled certain key differences that would increasingly distinguish the project of subaltern studies from that of English Marxist historiography. With hindsight, it can be said that there were three broad areas in which subaltern studies differed from the history from below approach of Hobsbawm or Thompson. Allowing for differences between these two eminent historians of England and Europe, subaltern historiography necessarily entailed a relative separation of the history of power from any universalist histories of capital, a critique of the nation form, and an interrogation of the relation between power and knowledge, hence of the archive itself and of history as a form of knowledge. In these differences, I would argue, lay the beginnings of a new way of theorizing the intellectual agenda for post-colonial histories. The critical theoretical break came with the way in which Guho sought to redefine the category the political with reference to colonial India. He argued that both the Cambridge and the nationalist historians conflated the political domain with the formal side of governmental and institutional processes. As he put it, in all writings of this kind, elitist historiography, the parameters of Indian politics are assumed to be or enunciated as those of the institutions introduced by the British for the government of the country. Elitist historians can do no more than equate politics with the aggregation of activities and ideas of those who were directly involved in operating these institutions, that is, the colonial rulers and their elites, the dominant groups in native society. Using people and subaltern classes synonymously and defining both as the demographic difference between the total Indian population and the dominant indigenous and foreign elite, Guho claimed that there was in colonial India an autonomous domain of the politics of the people that was organized differently than the domain of the politics of the elite. Elite politics involved vertical mobilization and a greater reliance on Indian adaptations of British parliamentary institutions, and tended to be relatively more legalistic and constitutional in orientation. In the domain of subaltern politics, on the other hand, mobilization for political intervention depended on horizontal affiliations such as the traditional organization of kinship and territoriality, or on class consciousness, depending on the level of the consciousness of the people involved. Subaltern politics tended to be more violent than elite politics. Central to subaltern mobilizations was the notion of resistance to elite domination. The experience of exploitation and labor endowed this politics with many idioms, norms, and values which put it in a category apart from elite politics, wrote Guha. Peasant uprisings in colonial India, he argued, reflected this separate and autonomous grammar of mobilization in its most comprehensive form. Even in the case of resistance and protest by urban workers, the figure of mobilization was one that was derived directly from peasant insurgents. Guha's separation of elite and subaltern domains within the political had some radical implications for social theory and historiography. The standard tendency in global Marxist historiography until the 1970s was to look on peasant revolts organized along the axis of kinship, religion, caste, etc., as movements exhibiting a backward consciousness, the kind that in his work on social banditry and primitive rebellion Hobsbawm had called pre-political. This was seen as a consciousness that had not quite come to terms with the institutional logic of modernity or capitalism. As Hobsbawm put it with reference to his own material, they are pre political people who have not yet found or only begun to find a specific language in which to express their aspirations about the world. By explicitly rejecting the characterization of peasant consciousness as pre political and by avoiding evolutionary models of consciousness, Guha was prepared to suggest that the nature of collective action against exploitation in colonial India was such that it effectively led to a new constellation of the political. To ignore the problems that peasants' participation in the modern political sphere could cause for a Eurocentric Marxism would lead, according to Guho, only to elitist histories. For one would then not know how to analyze the consciousness of the peasant, the discourses of kinship, caste, religion, and ethnicity through which they expressed themselves in protest, except as a backward consciousness trying to grapple with a changing world whose logic it could never fully comprehend. Guha insisted that instead of being an anachronism in a modernizing colonial world, the peasant was a real contemporary of colonialism and a fundamental part of the modernity to which colonial rule gave rise in India. The peasant was not a backward consciousness, a mentality left over from the past, baffled by modern political and economic institutions, yet restrained to them. Guha suggested that the insurgent peasant in colonial India did in fact read his contemporary world correctly. Examining, for instance, over 100 known cases of peasant rebellions in British India between 1783 and 1900, Guha showed that these always involved the deployment by the peasants of codes of dress, speech, and behavior that tended to invert the codes through which their social superiors dominated them in everyday life. Inversion of the symbols of authority was almost inevitably the first act of rebellion by insurgent peasants. Elitist histories of peasant uprisings missed the signification of this gesture by seeing it as pre political. Anil Seal, for example, dismissed all 19th century peasant revolts in colonial India as having no specific political content, being uprisings of the traditional kind, that reaching for sticks and stones as the only way of protesting against distress. Marxists, on the other hand, explained these gestures as either expressing a false consciousness or performing a safety valve function in the overall social system. What both these exemplary strategies missed, Guha contended, was the fact that at the beginning of every peasant uprising, there was inevitably a struggle on the part of rebels to destroy all symbols of the social prestige and power of the ruling classes. It was this fight for prestige which was at the heart of insurgency. Inversion was its principal modality. It was a political struggle in which the rebel appropriated and or destroyed the insignia of his enemy's power and hoped thus to abolish the marks of his own subalternity. I have emphasized the word political in this quotation in order to point up a creative tension between the Marxist lineage of subaltern studies and the more challenging question that the series raised from the very beginning about the nature of power in non Western colonial modernities. Guha's point was that the arrangements of power in which peasants and other subaltern classes found themselves in colonial India contained two very different logics of hierarchy and oppression. One was the logic of the quasi liberal legal and institutional framework introduced by the British. Imbricated with this was another set of relationships in which hierarchy was based on the direct and explicit domination and subordination of the less powerful through both ideological, symbolic means and physical force. The semiotics of domination and subordination were what the subaltern classes sought to destroy every time they rose up in rebellion. The semiotics could not be separated in the Indian case from what in English we inaccurately refer to as either the religious or the supernatural. The tension between a familiar narrative of capital and a more radical understanding of it can be seen in Guho's elementary aspects itself. There are times when Guho tends to read domination and subordination in terms of an opposition between feudal and capitalist modes of production. There is a respectable tendency in Marxist or liberal scholarship to read certain kinds of undemocratic relationships, personalized systems of authority, and practices of deification, for instance, as survivals of a pre capitalist era, as not quite modern. They are seen as indicative of the problems of the transition to capitalism, the assumption being that a full blown capitalism would or should be logically incompatible with feudal type relationships. These statements repeat a familiar structure that is often given to the European story of the transition to capitalism. First, the peasants' land is expropriated. Then the peasants join the ranks of the urban and industrial workers, whereupon they negotiate the disciplining process of the factory. Next, they engage in machine breaking and other forms of Luddite protest until trade unions arrive on the scene and certain formal freedoms indicative of a growing democratic consciousness are put in place. In this fundamentally Eurocentric and stagist view of history, however modulated by theories of uneven development, the peasant is a figure of the past and must mutate into the industrial worker in order to emerge eventually as the citizen subject of modern democracies. Where this mutation does not quite occur, yet the peasant still becomes an actor in the modern political sphere. As in anti colonial nationalisms, the peasant remains, as we have seen, the bearer of what Hobsbawm calls a pre political consciousness. Guho's elementary aspects does sometimes speak within this tradition of analysis. Direct domination, Guho tells us, is a feature of lingering feudalism. Taking the subcontinent as a whole, capitalist development in agriculture remained merely incipient. Until 1900s, rents constituted the most substantial part of income yielded by property in land. The element that was constant in this landlord peasant relationship in all its variety was the extraction of the peasant's surplus by means determined rather less by the free play of the forces of a market economy than by the extra economic force of the landlords standing in local society and in the colonial polity. In other words, it was a relationship of domination and subordination, a political relationship of the feudal type, or as it has been appropriately described, a semi-feudal relationships which derived its material substance from pre-capitalist conditions of production and its legitimacy from a traditional culture still paramount in the superstructure. This particular Marxist narrative, however, underrepresents the force and larger significance of Guho's critique of the category pre political. For if one were to accept the Marxism of this quotation, one could indeed come back at Guho and argue that the sphere of the political hardly ever abstracted itself from other spheres, those of religion, kinship, culture, in feudal relationships of domination and subordination, and that, in that sense, feudal relationships of power could not properly be called political. The lingering existence of feudal type relationships in the Indian scene could then be read, as Guho indeed does at the beginning of the quotation just offered, as a mark of the incompleteness of the transition to capitalism. By this logic, the so called semi feudal relationships and the peasants' mentality could indeed be seen as leftovers from an earlier period, still active, no doubt, but underworld historical notice of extinction. All India needed was to institute more capitalist institutions, and the process of the conversion of the peasant into the citizen, the properly political figure of personhood, would begin. This indeed was Hobsbawm's logic. That is why his pre political characters, even when they are broken into capitalism, and even when Hobsbawm acknowledges that the acquisition of political consciousness by these primitive rebels is what makes our century the most revolutionary in history, always remain in the position of being classic outsiders to the logic of capitalism. It comes to them from outside insidiously by the operation of economic forces which they do not understand and over which they have no control. In rejecting the category pre political, however, Guho insists on the specific history of modern democracy in India and on differences in the histories of power in colonial India and in Europe. This gesture is radical in that it fundamentally pluralizes the history of power in global modernity and separates it from any universal history of capital. Hobsbawm's material, Guho writes, is of course derived almost entirely from the European experience, and his generalizations are perhaps in accord with it. Whatever its validity for other countries, the notion of pre political peasant insurgency helps little in understanding the experience of colonial India. If we see the colonial formation in India as a case of modernity in which the domain of the political, as Guho argues in introducing subaltern studies, is irreducibly split into the two distinct logics that get braided together all the time: the logic of formal, legal, and secular frameworks of governance, and that of relationships of direct domination and subordination that derive their legitimacy from a different set of institutions and practices, including those of dharma. Dharma is often translated as religion. Then Guho's writing helps open up a very interesting problem in the global history of modernity and citizenship. Ultimately, this is the problem of how to think about the history of power in an age when capital and the governing institutions of modernity increasingly develop a global reach. Karl Marx's discussion of capitalist discipline assumed that the rule of capital entailed the transition to capitalist power relationships, the overseer's penalty book replacing the slave driver's lash. Foucault's work shows that if we want to understand the key institutions of modernity that originated in the West, the juridical model of sovereignty celebrated in modern European political thought must be supplemented by the notions of discipline, biopower, and governmentality. Guho claims that in the colonial modernity of India, this supplementation must include an extra pair of terms: domination and subordination. Not because India is anything like a semi modern or a semi capitalist or semi feudal country, and not because capital in India rules merely by formal subsumptions. Guho goes beyond the argument that reduces questions of democracy and power in the subcontinent to propositions about an incomplete transition to capitalism. He does not deny the connections of colonial India to the global forces of capitalism. His point, however, is that the global history of capitalism need not reproduce everywhere the same history of power. In the calculus of modernity, power is not a dependent variable and capital an independent one. Capital and power can be treated as an analytically separate categories. Traditional European Marxist political thought that fuses the two is therefore always relevant, but inadequate for theorizing power in colonial modern histories. The history of colonial modernity in India created a domain of the political that was heteroglossic in its idioms and irreducibly plural in its structure, interlocking within itself strands of different types of relationships that did not make up a logical whole. One such strand critical to the functionings of authority in Indian institutions was that of direct domination and subordination of the subaltern by the elite. As Goho put it in the first contribution to subaltern studies, this strand of domination and subordination ubiquitous in power relationships in India was traditional only insofar as its roots could be traced back to pre colonial times, but it was by no means archaic in the sense of being outmoded. The social domination and subordination of the subaltern by the elite was thus an everyday feature of Indian capitalism itself. This was a capitalism of colonial origins. Reading critically some key texts of Marx, Guho argued that the modern capitalism was quintessentially the historical condition in which an expansive and increasingly global capital came to dominate non Western societies without effecting or requiring any thoroughgoing democratic transformation in social relationships of power and authority. The colonial state, the ultimate expression of the domain of the political in colonial India, was both a result and a condition of possibility of such domination. As Guho put it, colonialism could continue as a relation of power in the subcontinent only on the condition that the colonizing bourgeois should fail to live up to its own universalizing project. The nature of the state it had created by the sword made this historically necessary. The result was a society that no doubt changed under the impact of colonial capitalism, but one in which vast areas in the life and consciousness of the people escaped any kind of bourgeois hegemony. The Indian culture of the colonial era, Guho argued elsewhere, defined understanding either as a replication of the liberal bourgeois culture of 19th century Britain or as the mere survival of an antecedent pre capitalist culture. This was capitalism, but a capitalism without capitalist hierarchies, a capitalist dominance without a hegemonic capitalist culture, or in Guho's famous terms, dominance without hegemony. Subaltern studies and the reorientation of history. Guho's two formulations that both nationalism and colonialism were involved in instituting in India a rule of capital in which bourgeois ideologies exercised dominance without hegemony, and that the resulting forms of power in India could not be termed pre political, had several implications for historiography. Some of these were worked out in Guho's own writings and some in those of his colleagues. It is important, however, that we clarify these implications, for they are what made subaltern studies an experiment in post-colonial historiography. First of all, Guho's critique of the category pre-political challenged his historicism by rejecting all stagist theories of history. If, as has been discussed, the term pre political took its validity from categorizing certain kinds of power relationships as pre modern, feudal, etc. Guho's discussion of power in colonial India resists such a clear distinction between the modern and the post-modern, pre-modern relationships in India that looked feudal when seen through a stagist view of history were contemporaneous with all that looked modern to the same point of view. From Guho's perspective, however, the former could not be looked on through geologic or evolutionist metaphors of survival or remnant without such historicism becoming elitist in its interpretation of the past. Subaltern studies then was, in principle, opposed to nationalist histories that portrayed nationalist leaders as ushering India and its people out of some kind of pre capitalist stage into a world historical phase of bourgeois modernity. properly fitted out with an artifacts of democracy, the rights of citizenship, a market economic freedom of the press, and the rule of law. There is no doubt that the Indian political elite internalized and used this language of political modernity, but this democratic tendency existed alongside and interlarded with undemocratic relationships of domination and subordination. This coexistence of two domains of politics, said Guho, was the index of an important historical truth, that is, the failure of the bourgeois to speak for the nation. There was, in fact, no unitary nation to speak for. Rather, the more important question was how and through what practices an official nationalism emerged that claimed to represent such a unitary nation. A critical stance toward official or statist nationalism and its attendant historiography marked subaltern studies from the beginning. Post colonial history was, thus, also a pre nationalist from the historiography. Pre nationalist form of historiography. Yes, Guho's quest for a history in which the subaltern was the maker of his own destiny brought into focus the question of the relation between texts and power. Historical archives are usually collections of documents, texts of various kinds. Historians of peasants and other subaltern social groups have long emphasized the fact that peasants do not leave behind their own documents. Historians concerned with recuperating the peasant experience in history have often turned for help to the resources of other disciplines: anthropology, demography, sociology, archaeology, human geography, etc. In his well known study of 19th century rural France, Peasants into Frenchmen, Eugene Weber provides a succinct formulations of this approach. These illiterate are not, in fact, inarticulate. They can and do express themselves in several ways. Sociologists, ethnologists, geographers, and most recently demographic historians have shown us new and different means of interpreting evidence. In the 1960s and 1970s, E.P. Thompson, Keith Thomas, and others turned to anthropology in search of the experiences of the subaltern classes. Guho's approach is interestingly different from that of these historians. He begins in elementary aspects by recognizing the same problem as do Weber, Thomas, Thompson, and others, that peasants do not speak directly in archival documents which are usually produced by the ruling classes. Like these historians, Guho too uses a diversity of disciplines in tracking the logic of peasant consciousness at the moment of rebellion. But he thinks of the category consciousness differently. In insisting on the autonomy of the consciousness of the insurgent peasant, he does not aim to produce generalizations that sum up what every empirical peasant participating in rebellions in colonial India must have thought, felt, or experienced. Guho's critique of the term tree political legitimately barred this path of thinking, which, however well intentioned, ends up making peasants into relatively exotic objects of anthropology. Guho thought of consciousness and therefore of peasant subjecthood as something immanent in the very practices of peasant insurgency. Elementary Aspects is a study of the practices of insurgent peasants in colonial India, not of a reified category called consciousness. The aim of the book was to bring out the collective imagination inherent in the practices of peasant rebellion. Guho makes no claim that the insurgent consciousness that he discusses is indeed conscious, that it existed inside the heads of peasants. He does not equate consciousness with the subject's view of himself. Rather, he examines rebel practices to decipher the particular relationships between elites and subalterns and among subalterns themselves that are acted out in them, and then attempts to derive from these relationships the elementary structure, as it were, of the consciousness or imagination inherent in those relationships. In keeping with the structuralist tradition with which he affiliates his book by the very use of the word elementary in its title, Guho describes his hermeneutical strategy through the metaphor of reading. The available archives on peasant insurgencies are produced by the counter-insurgency measures of the ruling classes and their armies and police forces. Guho therefore emphasizes the need for the historian to develop a conscious strategy for reading the archives. The aim of this strategy is not simply to discern and sift the biases of the elites, but to analyze the very textual properties of these documents in order to get at the history of power that produced them. Without such a scanning device, Guho argued, historians tend to reproduce the same logic of representation as that used by the elite classes in dominating the subaltern. The interventionist metaphor of reading resonates as the opposite of E.P. Thompson's use in the course of his polemic with Althusser of the passive metaphor of listening in describing the hermeneutical activity of the historian. This emphasis on reading also left subaltern studies historiography open to the influences of literary and narrative theory. In thus critiquing historicism and Eurocentrism and using that critique to interrogate the idea of the nation, in emphasizing the textual properties of archival documents, in considering representation as an aspect of power relationships between the elite and the subaltern, Guho and his colleagues moved away from the guiding assumptions of the history from below approach of English Marxist historiography. With Guho's work, Indian history took, as it were, the proverbial linguistic turn. From its very beginning, subaltern studies positioned itself on the unorthodox territory of the left. What is inherited from Marxism was already in conversation with other and more recent currents of European thought, particularly structuralism, and there was a discernible sympathy with early Foucault in this way in which Guho's writings posed the knowledge power question by asking what are the archives and how are they produced. Subaltern studies since 1988, multiple circuits. Ranojit Guho retired from the editorial team of Subaltern Studies in 1988. In the same year, an anthology anthology entitled Selected Subaltern Studies, published from New York, launched the global career of the project. Edward Said wrote a foreword to the volume describing Guho's statement regarding the aims of subaltern studies as intellectually insurrectionary. Gayatri Spivak's Deconstructing Historiography, which had first appeared in Subaltern Studies 6, 1986, served as the introduction to this collection. This essay and a review essay by Rosalind O. Arnold, first published in the Journal of Modern Asian Studies in 1980, had a serious effect on the later intellectual trajectory of the Subaltern project. Both Spivak and O. Hanlon pointed to the absence of gender questions in subaltern studies. Both also made a more fundamental criticism of the theoretical orientation of the project, pointing out that in effect, subaltern studies historiography operated within an idea of the subject. In Guho's words, to acknowledge the subaltern as the maker of his own destiny that had not wrestled at all with contemporary critiques of the very idea of the subject itself. Spivak's famous Can the Subaltern Speak? A critical and challenging reading of a conversation between Foucault and Deleuze forcefully posed those and related questions by raising deconstructive and philosophical objections to any straightforward program of letting the subaltern speak. Subaltern studies scholars have since tried to take these criticisms into account in this work. The charge that they do not tackle gender issues or engage feminist scholarship has been met to some degree by Ranojit Guho, Partho Chatterjee, and Sushi Thoru, among others. Partho Chatterjee's 1986 Nationalist Thought and the Colonial World creatively applied Scythian and post-colonial perspectives to the study of non-Western nationalisms, using India as an example. With this work, which extended Guho's criticisms of nationalist historiography into a full-blown, brilliant critique of nationalist thought, and Gyanendra Pandey's book on the history of the partition of India in 1947, the post-colonial critique may truly be said to have become a post-nationalistic critique as well. The influence of deconstructionist and postmodern thought in subaltern studies may be traced in the way in which the work of Gyanendra Pandey, Partho Chatterjee, and Shahid Amin has in the 1990s come to privilege the idea of the fragment over that of the whole or totality. Pandey's The Construction of Communalism in Colonial North India and his 1992 essay in defense of the fragments, Chatterjee's 1994 The Nation and Its Fragments, and Amin's experimental and widely acclaimed 1995 event memory metaphor all question on both archival and epistemological grounds. Even the very possibility of constructing a totalizing national history in narrating the politics of subaltern life. This move has also understandably given rise to a series of writings from subaltern studies scholars in which history itself as a European form of knowledge has come under critical investigation. Gyan Prakash, Ranajit Guha, Partho Chatterjee, Shahid Amin, Ajoy Scaria, Sail Mayaram, and others have made significant contributions to the analysis of colonial discourse. With this growing engagement with the works of Homi Bhabha, Gayatri Spivak, and Edward Said, subaltern studies has emerged as a project in conversation with post colonial studies. Where does subaltern studies, both the series and the project, stand today? As the crossing of many different pathways, it seems. The original project has been developed and furthered in the work of individual members of the collective. David Arnold's study of British colonialism in India in terms of histories of contested bodily practices colonizing the body, David Hardiman's study of the political and the economical cultures of subaltern lives caught the emergent forms of capitalism in the Indian state of Gujarat, the coming of the Devi and feeding the Banya, and Gautam Bhadra's study of a number of texts having to do with peasant society in 18th and 19th century Bengal, Iman o Nishan are examples of projects in which the possibilities of the original theoretical historiographic project are worked out and illustrated through concrete historical example. At the same time, it must be acknowledged that subaltern studies has exceeded the original historiographic agenda that it is set for itself in the early 1980s. The series now has, as I said at the outset, both global and regional locations in the circuits of scholarship that it traverses. This expansion beyond the realms of Indian history has earned for the series both praise and criticism. Much of the controversy follows roughly the contours of the global and ongoing debates between Marxists and postmodernists. Like Marxists elsewhere, Indian Marxists charge that the postmodernist valorization of the fragment in subaltern historiography hurts the cause of the unity of the oppressed and helps Hindu extremists. Many of the Marxist opponents of subaltern studies believe that such unity is aided by a social analysis that helps bring the different publics of the oppressed together by finding global and totalizing causes behind their oppression. Defenders of subaltern studies point out in reply that the public sphere in India and elsewhere has fragmented under the pressure of democracy and that it cannot be united artificially by a Marxism that insists on reducing the many diverse experiences of oppression and marginalization to the single axis of class or even to the triple axis of class, gender, and ethnicity. Achieving a critical perspective on European forms of knowledge, they would add, is part of the interrogation of their colonial inheritance that post colonial intellectuals must carry out. Their critique of nationalism, they would insist, has nothing in common with the nationalist chauvinism of the Hindu parties. It is not my purpose here to evaluate this debate. It is not my purpose here to evaluate this debate, which I treat in more detail in chapter 2. The point of this exercise has been to rebut the charge that subaltern studies lost its way by falling into the bad company of post colonial theory. Through a discussion of what Guho wrote in the 1980s, I have sought to demonstrate some necessary connections between the original aims of the subaltern studies project and current discussions of post coloniality. Subaltern studies was not a case of the application to Indian material of methods of historical research already worked out in the metropolitan Marxist tradition of history from below. It was in part a product of this lineage But the nature of political modernity in colonial India made this project of history writing nothing short of an engaged critique of the academic discipline of history itself. What distinguished the story of political modernity in India from the usual and comparable narratives of the West was the fact that modern politics in India was not founded on an assumed death of the peasant. The peasant did not have to undergo a historical mutation into the industrial worker in order to become the citizen subject of the nation. The peasant who participated in forms of massed nationalist struggles against the British was not a pre political subject. The formal granting of the rights of citizenship to the Indian peasant after the achievement of independence from the British simply recognized his already political nature. But this fact also meant that the imagination that could properly be called political in the Indian context did not conform to the ideas of thinkers in the West, who theorized the political as a story of human sovereignty in a disenchanted world. If the peasant was not pre political and was not to be treated simply as an object of anthropology, then the very history of the politicization of the masses in India showed that the political included actions that challenged the theorists' usual and inherited separation between politics and religion. It can be seen in retrospect that subaltern studies was a democratic project meant to produce a genealogy of the peasant as citizen in contemporary political modernity.